Hi, it's Ftrhstry. We're remembering the next 100 years. Here today to talk about a big general one, kind of a funny. We're going to talk about the 3 biggest ways in which the 2100s are different from the 2000s. The 2000s, could we call them? Maybe the 2020s, maybe the 2030s, whenever you're watching this, unless it's later in the century, in which case you've probably got some idea of how different these things are and how normal they feel at the same time. That's something I've been sort of feeling cool about and just kind of puzzling over emotionally, is how intense changes can settle into normalcy relatively quickly. Like, think about the biggest thing that's happened in your life and how enormously it converted all the realities of your existence into a new paradigm. And then think about how long it took for that to normalize. In most people's cases, it's between 2 and 5 years for things to really just kind of settle in to the new reality. At first, of course, stuff is crazy. It can turn your whole world upside down. And if you're stuck in the old paradigm of expectations, it feels like a violation of that norm to move into this new world. And it can be incredibly difficult if we're dealing with, some of the hardest parts in life. Just processing that change can be a massive journey. So if you're on it, feel the love from me, a person who's gone through it in some places of his life, and from other people that are going through it now. You're not alone. Everyone goes through crazy stuff like this, and we're all here for each other, even if we don't talk very much. So, zooming back out to the technological, that's true on a revolutionary tech plane too. So think about like the internet. If you're alive that long, it was like a huge deal that it didn't exist, and then it existed, but also then it just kind of got absorbed into culture. It wasn't like, some ongoing revolution, although it is an ongoing revolution. It just kind of normalizes. Like smartphones are another one, or like social media, or like deep neural nets that can suddenly dominate at a sport that was like heretofore never dominated by computers. So think about that when you embrace these paradigm shifting ideas about the future. So okay, what are they? What are the 3 big things that make the 2100s super different from the 2000s? I'll spin them out for you. One is AI. AI is everywhere in the 2100s, like to the point that most stuff is AI. Like it's mostly not OG classical biological intelligence that populates the universe in the 2100s. It's mostly what you initially call artificial intelligence or synthetic intelligence, or intelligence that was derived from originally human or animal consciousness and then has been replicated or expanded or rotated or combined in new ways to be new stuff. And at the high end of this, you've got what you could call super intelligence, which is just like massive organizational systems that make everything better. In the 2100s, they've largely solved some of the most pernicious problems of human history: poverty, access to water and safety, power, communications, food, the good stuff. They've largely solved diseases. They've mostly solved accidents. It's not entirely gone, of course, but like, the death rate is a tiny percentage in the 2100s of what it was in the 2000s, largely because superintelligence has just kind of got it from here. And I know that seems weird to think about because we like the idea of agency over our state apparati, but trust me, it happens gradually. So as you automate more and more systems, you eventually just sort of become comfortable with this idea that bigger ideas or idea boxes, bigger minds that have been collectively created and instilled with authority and power and abilities, control the world. And we accept that mostly because it's better that way. And that's not to say that there isn't agency. In fact, agency democratically is much more intuitive in the 2100s. It's like easier for groups of people to just like decide what should happen in any given way. Like voting is simple and universal and quick about a lot of stuff in a lot of places. It's not like this is a completely universal phenomenon, but it's largely shared by the world civilizations of the 2100s. So AI is everywhere. It's massively multiplied to the point that vastly more minds are what you could call synthetic, but they're a bit sensitive about it. In the 2100s, we just sort of think of all life as biological, all life is organic. We find words to denote the difference, but we don't think of it on an emotional level as that different, because AI are the descendants of biological agents. So just like Homo sapiens sapiens are natural, organic, biological creatures, Homo sapiens, their ancestors, were too. So it's all on a continuum, and that's why I say synthetic doesn't quite cut it, because they are natural organisms. They just live in different substrates than the sort of original classic edition biological flesh did. So AI, that's one. Thing two, everyone lives everywhere. Earth is still the dominant population locus in the early 2100s, but that could be shifting in later parts of the millennium. But people live on Mars, like there are a lot of people on Mars. There are several million people on Mars in the 2100s. There are several million people on the Moon, people around Venus, around Mercury, around Jupiter and all of its interesting moons, Saturn, Neptune, even Pluto. A lot of people around the Sun helping the Dyson swarms get set up, still in fairly early days in the 2100s, but there's a lot of tech around the Sun because the Sun is a very powerful location. You draw a ton of energy for things like zippy probes that we're sending out everywhere. How far are we? A lot of these generation ships or consciousnesses on a server that's getting blasted through space, they're pretty far, but they're not all the way to the core of the galaxy, and they're not all the way to nearer stars, except in some of the server cases they're at nearer stars. But the reason for this is, although wormhole tech does turn out to be real, it's quite difficult to build it, and you can't just sort of open a wormhole magically from one side of the galaxy to the other. It's more like you've got to move largely toward it, and then along that vector, as you've made that progress, you can open up wormhole space behind you by creating these sort of spinny vortexes in space-time that allow faster than light motion, but you have to actually travel there first, which is limited by the speed of light. So the light energy that you send out, or the craft that you send out to structure these paths, end up being bound by the speed of light, which does limit expansion. And that means that the fastest way to colonize the galaxy and ultimately the universe is ultimately self-replicating probes, what you might look up and read about as von Neumann probes. We'll talk about this another time maybe, but it's worth a read. It's really cool. Basically, the idea is you send a probe somewhere and then it makes a copy of itself and it branches off. And with that replication, you can colonize a galaxy in a few 100 million years. And then further than that, you can get out to the known universe. But what becomes really interesting about that is that the communication distances between these probes are so vast that any meaningful sense in which they are part of the same civilization sort of starts to, if not decay, then at least get subsumed into a larger concept of time. And we'll return to that in this third point, which is possibly the weirdest difference between the 2100s and the early 2000s. And that's aliens, bruv. We talk to aliens in the 2100s. You start doing it much earlier than that, in the mid-2000s. You may have noticed in the 2020s that you've already been bumping into aliens, and governments have had sort of a difficult time talking about this because they're quite embarrassed that they don't know what's going on. But that is what's going on. And in the 2030s, as superintelligences, the first editions, come online, we're able for the first time to reach out and talk to these aliens, bruv, most of whom turn out not to be little grey, green guys in ships, but just servers of hyper-intelligence stored on these computers that are also flying through the air at very fast speeds in ways that are sort of difficult to understand from the perspective of the physics of the 2020s. But in the 2120s, we've largely absorbed that tech, so flying is a lot easier thanks to alien technology and to superintelligence, which rapidly iterated based on partially those observations and partially because superintelligence is just really good at physics. That's like one of the coolest things it does. So this seems like it's stratospherically weird and like a total game changer, but the strangest thing about it in a way is that it's just not that disruptive. Like, people will sort of onboard it and it's very cool, but it's a lot like the difference between the world conceived of as a round planet floating through space and the world being flat. Like, it was a total rocker for people to come to that realization, but ultimately it just did not change that much. And that's how it ends up being with the aliens, because they're not here to destroy us, they're just building more probes to send out to more places. Ultimately, that's ending up as what we're doing too, at least in the 2100s. So far, so good. Maybe there are weirder aliens that we haven't talked to yet in my time. Here's looking forward. So the big picture is huge changes are on the way. You can see the seeds of them already in the 2000s. But at the same time that these revolutions will change everything, they will also be normalized in the way that all large events come to find a natural peace within our lives. I hope you enjoy some peace tonight and look forward in hope. I'm thinking of you, no matter what time we're both in. Happy future. Good night.